as we continue the theme out of the series of sermons on suffering. This morning we want to come to grips with the question, why do the innocent suffer? As a foundation for what I want to say, I read from the book of Job, the oldest book in the Bible, the 2nd chapter, verse 1 and 10, and the 42nd chapter, verses 1 through 5. When the day came for the heavenly beings to appear before the Lord again, Satan was there among them. The Lord asked him, "Where have you been?" Satan answered, "I've been walking here and there, roaming around the earth." The Lord asked, "Did you notice my servant Job? There is no one on earth as faithful and good as he. He worships me and is careful not to do anything evil. You persuaded me to let you attack him for no reason at all. But Job is still as faithful as ever." Satan replied, "A man will give up everything in order to stay alive. But now suppose you hurt his body. He will then curse you for your faith." So the Lord said to Satan, "All right, he's in your power. You can do anything to him, but you cannot kill him." Then Satan left the Lord's presence and made sores break out all over Job's body. So Job went and sat by the garbage dump and took a piece of broken pottery and began to scratch his sores. His wife said to him, "You're still as faithful as ever, aren't you? Why don't you curse God and die?" Job answered to his wife, "You're talking nonsense. When God sends us something good, we welcome it. How can we complain when he sends us trouble?" Even in all this suffering, Job did not say anything against God. "I know, Lord, that you are all-powerful, that you can do everything you want. You ask how I dare question your wisdom when I am so very ignorant. I talk about things I did not understand, about marvels too great for me to know. You told me to listen while you spoke and to try to answer your questions. Then I knew only what others had told me, but now I have seen you with my own eyes of faith. And so I am ashamed of all that I have said, and I repent in sackcloth and ashes." In this series of sermons dealing with suffering, we said the following thing. It is indeed most mysterious and difficult subject for one to cover. We never intended to exhaust the subject. Our hope was simply to start you in the process of thinking. Last Sunday, we gave you 3 ideas of why God allows suffering. They were: God allows suffering in order that we might learn, that we might become educated individuals. Secondly, we said suffering was allowed because it is a protective plan. Thirdly, we said that suffering is allowed because there is sin in this world, and sin usually brings about some form of suffering. Now I want you to think with me this morning on this matter. Why do the innocent suffer? The problem of suffering would be much easier to understand if we could prove that every sufferer has broken some law or some rule of God. What makes the problem so torturing for so many people is that thousands suffer for causes which are not their fault at all. This was one of the problems of the psalmist. He could not understand why is it that an individual who seems to go about absolutely ignoring the laws of God and ignoring the causes of humanity seem to prosper, while many individuals who love God and love people and seem to live a righteous and upright life It seems as though they are constantly suffering. Therefore, looking upon such destruction in the lives of human beings, we are tempted to lose our faith in God, since some of our actions seem to be compared to those of one who, not content that his children suffer for their own misdeeds, allows a trap to be set for them in the dark, so that they suffer agonies without any possibility of avoiding the pain of understanding. There is no easy answer to this question as why the innocent suffer. However, I think that we can gain some insight if you will be patient with me now and open up your mind and let the Spirit of God try to start you in some progress or some plan of thinking. For instance, to approach the question of suffering, we must first realize what pattern God chosen and planned for human nature to follow. There were open to God two alternatives. Number one is God could let us live independent lives, that is, individual lives, completely ostracized and isolated from anybody else. That is, where each individual would be entirely independent of the other. Now, had that been the way that God chose, then we would still be in the dark ages. For then we would not know the collective insight that have been gained by thousands of persons who have gone on before us. For instance, if you and I lived independently, completely ostracized from anybody else, none of the collective accumulated knowledge that have been available to us would be available to us. That is, now for a moment let us assume that this is the way that God designed for us to live. That is, that we would live by ourselves. So you suddenly become deathly ill. Yet, throw you on at this point of death, no one would come to assist you. No one would come to your aid. You see, you would go down to the hospital, but there'd be no hospital. Because, you see, we live independently. Nobody thinks about building a hospital. You would go to a doctor, but the doctor wouldn't know anything because he had not learned from the book that had been written from other doctors or other medical scientists. You would go down and you would try to get something to eat, but nothing would be available for you to eat. Because God ordained that you live an isolated life, independent from anybody else. Now that's not the way that God intended for us to live. The ideal for God's living is what we call the family plan. So we are all here in God's world, God's big living room. And we're all interdependent. That is, we depend on one another. And even this is brought about by the fact that wherever you go, whatever you do, you are living on the heritage of somebody else. Because if we all lived our little independent, isolated lives, there would be no advancement of civilization, because there would be no collective effort on the part of the individual to make our society. So then, we are members one with another. In a very real sense, anything that you do will involve others. I am dependent on you, and you are dependent on me. For instance, I was indebted to half of the world this morning before I even came to church. I got up and I washed my face with soap that was given by the French. The towel I used came from the Turks. The clothes that I donned came from the American or the English mills, or more or less from the Japanese. The dishes from which I ate my cereal were the result of the ancient Chinese artist pottery. The jelly on the table came from the craft of the Spaniards. And so you see, we have inherited from other people what we know. And if they had been living independent lives, they would not have cared one thing for us. But since we live as a family, then what one does affects the life of another. Much of what happens in our lives is due to accident, and there is no other way to explain it. For instance, a dedicated doctor and nurse are hard at work trying to save the life of a fellow sufferer. The nurse, in her haste to apply the pain-killing sedative, pushes the plunger of a hypodermic syringe too quickly. The needle pops off and flies out of the syringe and strikes the doctor in the eye, and the doctor becomes blind. Now, are we to curse God because such things take place? No. This happens, you see, because we are in a family, and each of us are trying to do something for somebody else. And because this is a reality, there's a possibility of an accident, and an accident usually produces suffering. You see, God has nothing to do with it, and we do not so intend for it to be so taken. It's just one of those uncontrollable things that happen because we're living on a family basis, and we have not yet learned to live in harmony with each other. For instance, because we live as a family, a husband is disobedient to the teachings of the laws of God relative to morals and relative to his marriage, and he goes out and he participates in the promiscuous acts of sin. His whole family is stigmatized and disgraced and suffers. Now, God didn't produce it, but because he is identified with a family, everybody in the family suffers because of the acts of the individual. This is the way that God ordained that we live. Not isolated lives, but family lives. Then the innocent suffer because of the selfishness of men. From a careful look at it, it's evident that God has placed enough here in this earth for all men. At no time in modern history has there not been enough for all people of the earth. God has seen fit for that. But the trouble comes in the method of distribution, which is used to get the provision to the needy. God's desire is that all men have sufficient bread and sufficient life-giving necessities. That is, God so ordained this world that there is sufficient food stuff for every individual. But you remember a few years back when there was a famine in India? Literally, there were silos and bins of wheat and corn in the United States and Canada that the Canadian government ordered to be dumped on the ground and bulldozers push it into the very bowels of the earth because of an oversupply. Did you remember in these United States when Irish potatoes were dumped and dye poured on them in order that they may not become edible? At the same time, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people starving. Somebody has said that before the wheat shipment to Russia, that there were grain bins dotting the western plains of this country containing enough foodstuff to feed millions and costing the United States $15,000 per minute to keep it in store. And so then the fault is not with God. The fault is with those of us who say that we belong to God. And it is indeed a difficult problem in economics, and I do not have the answer, except to say to you that God has made provision to eliminate a great deal of the suffering in this world. But mankind, because of his own selfishness, refuses to share what he has. Then the innocent suffer because the world is not yet where the world or where God would have it to be. In a very real sense, we are still in the world, and the world is not yet through being made, and neither are we. There are many secrets that are in this day being uncovered and made known to man, that had they been known in times past, would have done away with much of life's suffering. For instance, the scientists today are still trying to find the answer to cancer. Now, the laws of the splitting of the atom, and the atom has always been in the world. But God does not go around doing for man what man, out of God-given intelligence, must learn to do for himself. And so we have to wait until man dedicates himself and his intelligence to find the answer to many of the problems and ills that causes humanity to suffer. One of the great tragedies of this hour, and I speak without any apology, is that when man split the atom and turned into the realm of atomic energy, that he had at his fingertips some of the greatest power in all of the world. But the great tragedy of it was that in the very beginning, in approximately the first 15 or 20 years of this discovery, all of it was dedicated in the direction of the destruction of man in the power of war, rather than in the salvation of man by what atomic energy could do for the salvation of man. And so then, I come to you this morning with three simple statements. I believe that the innocent suffer, first of all, because we live in a sin. And what individuals do in that sin brings about direct results upon others. Secondly, I believe that we suffer because God is not yet pleased with us in this life. And then in the third place, I would remind you that I do not have an answer as to why you are suffering, but I do have this truth, that there is one who went through suffering, that is capable of understanding your suffering, and that is capable of giving you strength when you suffer. So never forget this. When we are suffering, God is bearing more than our share. And to rile against the suffering of an innocent is to disparage the suffering of the world's greatest sufferer, Jesus Christ. That well-loved Son comes to this human family. He became one with the family, for richer or poor, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. He took over the liabilities, though he can contain the greatest asset. In the prime of his manhood, this man we call Christ, because of the sins of the family, was visited upon him. But when the blood beaded from under the thorns on the majestic brow, when the lash fell, making great welts across his back, when rough iron nails tore through the hands so often raised in benediction and healing, when the cross bearing its quivering load was dropped with a sickening thud into a hole prepared for it, lacerating the wounds in the hands and in the feet, there was no rebellion against the suffering of the innocent. Only silent acceptance on a dynamic stage, knowing that all was in the hands of a Father, and though he would not see the instant result, he knew that it was for the best. And even the greatest sufferer can only stand silent before the suffering Lamb of God, suffering because he became a part of the imperfect humanity. And he felt the selfishness of mankind. He lived in a world not yet perfected. Thus Christ suffered for the salvation of man and the glory of God. In Jesus Christ, then, God came over to our side to understand human suffering. He merged as a man. He picked up worse scars than any of mine. Jesus bent down to straighten twisted backs, long, lame. He took snub, illegitimate children into his own. He dared to touch unclean and isolated lepers, and they were made whole almost the moment he touched them. He forgave the paralysis of the guilt for those who openly sought relief. He was sensitive in spirit. He was tough in body. The carpenter's son from the hick town of Nazareth sweat blood at the prospect of his own death, not as a coward, but as a bearer of suffering for others. He agonized alone. He abandoned by friends when he needed them most. He was hated by the foe. He died not as some great grand hero, gallantly and dramatically, but as a naked and twisted criminal on a cross. The God who meets us in Christ does allow suffering. But the God who suffers in Jesus Christ is that same God who stands by. And he says, even though you do not understand, and even though there is no human explanation, I want you to know that I too suffered. But out of my suffering there was redemption. And out of my suffering there was an experience that helps me to understand your suffering. And so we come today, fellow sufferers in this world, to simply state that I do not have the answer as to why you suffer. But I do find that the grace of God is sufficient. And the one who suffers is the one who is sufficient for the sufferer. And about all that I can say to you is simply this. Put your hand in the hand of God and walk in faith. God our Father, Lord, there's so many unanswerable problems and conditions in this world. We could dig for 10,000 years and never find the answer. And so we better start where we are with what we have. And so we have an opportunity then to accept God as our companion in life. And when we cannot understand, about the only thing we can do is walk with Him, knowing that He will not leave us and that He will not forsake us, and that His grace has proven sufficient for those who have trusted in Him yesterday. In the name of Christ.